Yeah, welcome to the sig-testing meeting. I think we can just go ahead and get started. Ben, you had a topic on invariant testing?
Yeah, I don't think we have anybody to introduce this time. Let's
Mm-mm.
see. Uh, I don't know if this will even work. Um, okay. S- So something we've been discussing for a while, um, there is another KEP which I should pull up, and I'm going to really quick peek the KEP metadata to get the path to that one. Um, mm, this API machinery KEP for declarative validation. Um, so basically, the key thing you need to know about this one, I'll put a link in the chat, though I think it's already linked in uh um the new cap, um, which the README is linked from the issue. It's here. Um, So that in this declarative validation kept, they did something interesting where, um, well, first background, the they're writing a new way to validate everything in the APIs, declaratively. And so the problem with that is we need to make sure that it's fully compatible with the existing validation. So you need all the validation results to be the same. The goal is to be able to replace how it's implemented, but not the behavior at all, because that would be considered a breaking API change. So we want to move away from people writing complex hand-rolled functions that validate the API results to doing things like tagging a field with this field is an IP address, use the IP address validation logic. And then part of the goal of that is to make it easier to review new APIs so that again, instead of reading some complex handwritten function that may not be fully consistent, you can just see like, oh yeah, it has the like plus validate IP address tag. And you can do some more complex validations with cell if you need to for like cross-field validation, but for everything else, you just kind of like you can just tag some things like this field should have a maximum length, and then that all becomes totally standardized instead of a bunch of like completely ad hoc Turing complete arbitrary code. Um, but again, for all the existing validation, the goal is to migrate. And to do that, we need a very high confidence that there are no mismatch in behavior. So they've written unit tests, they've written integration tests, um, but they had an interesting idea that we haven't touched on before where they introduced a metric that tracks running both the previous implementation and the new implementation and counting mismatches. So that should never happen. If that happens, there's a bug. um, so we have this internal metric and API server that's not meant to really be user facing, but is actually so that we can detect if we have an implementation detail with a substantial refactor. And so the goal is for the immediate future, they don't actually switch to declarative validation for any of the core types. They just start to implement it and they run both in parallel silently and they ignore the declarative validation result, but we catch if it doesn't match and we use the existing imperative logic. So we need a way to test that to be able to really leverage it. Like I said, they have all these integration and unit tests, but this eventually the scope of this is all API validation in the Kubernetes API. So you could do unit tests, you can do fuzzing, but one of the best fuzzers that we have is we actually run lots of clusters in CI and we use the API a ton over the course of testing everything else. So the thinking is we should have the tests collect if this metric trips. This metric is a tripwire for there's a bug. And if that does happen, then you should be able to go look at the API server logs and find it. We had a lot of discussions amongst the testing leads in particular in the past because there's some concern that, well, what you're describing is a test that needs to run after everything else, and that has proven itself to be a foot gun in other projects and our past experience. And there's a little bit of slippery slope because now you have an ordering problem if you try to introduce more tests, and it's a way that something could be pretty flaky, and then who's responsible for it. So, sig testing doesn't do KEPs very often, but we have a KEP here to formalize the approach that I think, between a few of us, I think is reasonable here. Uh, the gist of it is tests will that check for this sort of invariant behavior over the scope of an entire end-to-end test run. They have to have a registered list of owners. They have to have some standardization that will be approved by the SIG testing leads. So you can't just arbitrarily add these. That includes some requirements like they're not allowed to make any writes. They're only allowed to make some reads to the system. Specifically, we're starting with metrics. They can read metrics, and we're not ad hoc implementing that either. We have some existing logic for that. We'll use that and standardize it. So basically, you can register, there's a metric to check with a check, and who owns the check. And then we also will have some standardized test failure reporting that will give the clear instructions about how to handle this failure and who to ping if there's issues with this test. Because we really don't want to introduce this new sort of like global test that's going to run by default in most jobs without an owner, and in this somewhat unusual way. Uh, but at the same time, the signal isn't very useful if it doesn't alert, and if it doesn't run in a lot of jobs. So we could build some whole new data collection system, but ultimately SIG testing already has kind of overburdened running triage and test grid and so on. And we have a system for tracking if something fails, it's the JUnit alerts with test grid. So um, I think actually versus the KEP, which I encourage you all to take a look at, what might be instructive is the prototype PR. Um, Ginkgo, which is the framework we use for the E2E tests, doesn't actually let you run a test after all the tests. You register the code, you register the framework, so you can just run arbitrary code. Um, and we could have done something like that. You can order a group of like subtests, but you can't just have a test that runs after all of the tests. Um, so one of the other requirements we want is that you need to be able to select in and out of this. We don't want this to start running during conformance test jobs, for example. But we do want it to sort of be selected as a default test and to follow the rules that we have so that we can also do things like tagging a test as flaky if it's causing problems. So came up with a little trick. You can write custom Ginkgo reporters, which is some logic that runs after the test run. We actually already do this to customize the JUnit output. And you can actually run multiple of them. So what we do here is we register a special reporter for the invariant metrics. And what this reporter does is it looks to see if a Sentinel test ran and passed. And if the Sentinel test ran and passed, then we will actually like collect metrics and check them. Um, if it didn't, then we won't run this logic at all, and we can like not report this. So um, you can get a separate pass fail that's synthesized at the end, and then you get all the control of normal test selection logic. So we just have a test that does exactly nothing. The it method is an empty function. So the only thing it does is it gets selected and it reports as pass fail. That's slightly annoying in that this reports pass fail. We might want to think a little bit, but that's why I've phrased it as should enable checking invariant metrics. So like if you're looking at the test result, what this test does is it enables it. So yes, that worked. Um, that passed. It's turned on. It flipped the bool by itself passing, and then we can check it. So this will be in a separate package, owned by the testing leads, so that we can agree on new ones because we do still think this is kind of high risk, introducing these tests that run after everything and try to check the state of everything. But I think this is really useful, and there's actually already a number of other use cases coming up. There's some similar metrics. Patrick, who can make it, is also looking at detecting log spam with this. Um, there are various cases where we want to look at how the whole system behaved and use basically all of the other end-to-end tests as a fuzzer. So that's what we're introducing here. We still want to encourage people to write unit tests, write integration tests, and write API fuzzing. But at least for this declarative validation feature, we have a good example of we're replacing a key subsystem over time, and it affects every API call. And we want to make sure that we got it totally right. So, um, hopefully, plan here is we can nail down the rest of the details on this KEP, get feedback from everyone, and we'll work with instrumentation and API machinery to enable this. And then in 135, we'll start doing this, starting with that declarative validation metric. But I expect very quickly that we're going to have follow-ups for other use cases. And so one of the things that we wanted, so the main goal of the KEP is to agree to what is permissible and how we go about this before we get all of those use case landing. Because we know when we once we add a test that runs after all the other tests and is super special, there's going to be requests for more. So, and we already had a fair bit of debate about how to approach this in some past meetings and if this is even a reasonable thing to do. So, I'd say keep that in mind. The biggest thing that we're looking for on the KEP is settling on what sorts of things are reasonable and what we do to prevent this being a flaky tragedy of the commons that's running everywhere. The PR is probably where we want to follow up on, was there a better way to make the framework do this? I don't think so. I looked a lot. This is not something that Ginkgo intends to enable. It randomizes the order of the tests, and as a general rule, that sort of thing makes sense. It also runs them in parallel, and like you don't really want this kind of coupling between them. But we do want to check things. Um, and like I said, the other really key thing about this is you can't write a test we're not going to permit any tests that do mutations. There's no writes. You can read, and so far my current plan is we will fetch the metrics once collectively and then pass the metrics to in metric checks. So we have one place that we need to make reliable that decides if it should run and fetches the metrics, and we're starting with the API server metrics, where I think that this is most likely to be useful. Anybody has questions, or please take a look at the KEP. I'm hoping to get this merged pretty soon because I would also like to start soaking this earlier in the release cycle so we can shake out any problems with it.
Yeah, that was my question. What's the timeline? The release schedule seems to be pretty tight.
Yeah. I would like to
And
get this really early in the cycle if we can.
yeah, but every we're talking weeks.
So we have a usable implementation right now. I think the main thing that we've been going back and forth on is the language of the failure notification. I updated that in the pull request. I think we still need to drive a little bit more consensus. The other thing that we got a little bit bogged down on was there was discussion between me and Antonio and Patrick about what happens if the job terminates early and we don't get to the results. And Antonio and I think the gist of our feedback was all tests have no guaranteed behavior if the system is interrupted early, and we should only be using the results of a job that was interrupted early to figure out why it didn't complete. Like if it timed out because things are taking too long or something like that, we shouldn't be relying on the test results. I think that we can probably get those resolved this week, barring any other key feedback here, and then I'll need to reflect any like bike shedding back into the pull request.
do we need to inform anybody that this is a cap not for the release and for tracking or PRR or whatever? It's just our.
We will need PRR by policy. I reached out to Joe about that API machinery. We have instrumentation and testing involved, and I sent it to their channels previously.
Yeah.
So I think we're good on that. Michelle?
I think my first question is basically answer like this is intended, like the first use is going to be for API, like validation, tripwire, effectively, but like this is intended to be a general process for other, SIGs to potentially add other checks for tests in general, for this kind of post-test, reporting.
Yeah. We know that people already have other thoughts about this, and we knew as soon as we set up something for this that they'll be asked to do more. So most of the purpose of the KEP is to kind of lay out some ground rules for what you should and shouldn't do, and then also actually the KEP also states that we're going to put the system for this in a separate package that has tight owners. So you need to reach out to sig-testing if you want to add another one of these, because we want to look at what you're doing.
I think that makes sense. I guess, two quick follow-ups is like, do we have timing expectations around like what this is expected to do? Since like, I assume since it's reads, it's probably expected to be low time and won't add anything to like the suites in general, even though it runs after everything.
Yeah. That's something that I was debating going back to and spelling on the KEP, but I was, to be honest, I'm a little concerned that we won't even ship this first one because we're going to spend the next release still bike shedding, and then like we need to get the soak. Also, this is a little bit of a blocker for the declarative validation effort progressing. They actually reached out to sig testing maybe even in 133, and like it's been controversial enough just between me and Patrick and Antonio in particular to nail down like what is there a reasonable way to approach this and make it good. But yeah, I think that's an important concern and something I have in my mind for the one that we're introducing now. Yeah, just fetching API server metrics should not be a significant time cost, and we actually already had some unused stuff in the API or in the E2E tests where you could set, I can't find evidence that anyone's using it, but there's a flag you can set to tell the test to just like dump all of the cluster metrics afterwards anyhow. So we already kind of indicated that's reasonable. But I've already had this discussion a bit with Patrick on the logs one where I'm like, imagine we wind up trying to dump the logs from all the components on a 5K node scale cluster. There's a reason we have like dedicated tooling for that, and it runs to like a separate GCS bucket and things. That is actually an enormous, incredibly expensive operation, and it's not totally portable either. I think we're definitely going to have some more follow-ups where people push the bounds on this even with reads. Which is also why we have the restricted owners on adding more of them. So, yeah. I don't know if we want to spell out something in more detail in the KEP.
Maybe just something loose, like basically, the timing is a required metric, like how long this takes has to be reported, because I imagine that'll be useful anyway. And like, sig testing has the right to push back against anything that's negatively impacting the health of the project, which I think is just, our purview anyway.
Yeah, that's actually already true, and it's true by way of the like we have the testing TLs and the owners and the proposed PR. I don't actually know if this, I'll have to look if it reports how long it takes. We're sort of abusing the like system that generates reports here.
I mean, I assume we can report it as a custom property or something, if not that, right? If not.
Yeah, we just might have to build more of it.
Okay.
I'll have to double check that part. What I've been doing is like testing it and tell you that at least the one we have right now does run quickly. And the other part of that was going to be that for all the metrics ones, they would share the actual metric fetch. There isn't actually a way in the API to say just give me this metric. You say give me the metrics, and you're going to receive all of them. So we already collect all of them in one pass. So any additional checks, there should not take any amount of time, because there's going to be like a, if variable thing, and we should just not let anyone write complicated API calls. But if we expand this to something that isn't metric collection like logs, then I think we're going to have to talk about, is that thing reasonable? And so that's where I was like, I don't know if we have to get all of that here. I think is going to wind up being a little bit case by case review, and like part of what we're establishing is just for doubling down on this is part of the end-to-end testing framework, and we're not going to grant wide permissions to expand this because it's ripe for abuse. You could do this in a test that doesn't run at the end anyhow. There's just I don't know, I think there's a different level of temptation. Like you're less likely to want to fetch all of the logs from the cluster in the middle of the run.
Okay, cool.
I will look at that though. But so far I've been like running and timing the entire thing, just doing this check or not. It's quick.
I guess that was the other thing is there an example? But I assume the MVP has. Sorry, I'm skimming it at the moment.
We will introduce one with the first implementation PR. Like it won't just be a system. Currently, the other thing that has to happen with that PR before we can actually merge it is the check is inverted intentionally, so you can see what the failure reporting behavior looks like, because I think that's one of the things we need to nail down and agree to. That is one of the things that's been bike shed so far, is the like specifics of how that failure message instructs you to handle it and when to reach out and ping the owners. Antonio?
Yeah, the other question is, did we settle in using metrics just for this? I mean, I really, we try to avoid to have a single mechanism for this, that now somebody doing events, so they're doing, matching on a log or something.
Yeah, I declare that we should start with metrics, but Patrick is already exploring looking at all logs to look for like spammy logs.
Okay.
He has that as like a draft PR that forks the MVP. So we probably will see more like that. And I'll point you to it. I've already been discussing a little bit on there that I'm concerned with that approach, and that I would recommend metric or something. His counterpoint was that you won't know which log is being spammy. I don't know. I'm gonna follow up on that. I think that
But the question is, that's what I'm concerned with this approach, is what has to be log spamming with invariant. I mean, invariant has a clear definition, right? We know that something cannot change its state, and that's why we ensure that. But why we want to put log spamming?
I don't, and it sounds like you don't. So we'll probably have to talk to Patrick more about that.
But
I don't
that's
think
not
it's
related to this, right?
no, I don't consider it related to this. The
Okay,
extent is
no, that's
but it is related in the sense that, I mean, Patrick has a prototype PR that forks this MVP for the KEP and does some log checking. And
but it's
there's a
not. But
parallel
I
discussion.
mean,
But I
it's a
don't
parallel
include that.
discussion.
But I
Okay.
don't include that as something in the. I believe that's not. Included. Yeah, the only mention of logs in here is the failure message, right? Because that's one thing that we wanted to get, was having the failure message kind of tell you when to look at your PR versus like reach out to the owners and who the owners are.
I think we need to be. The debate is important on what are the mechanisms and
I
what are
do
the.
say that they will be limited to read only, such as fetching metrics, and that they should be simple, reliable, and cheap. I don't know if we want to
why
put
don't
more
we?
specifics on that.
That's what I'm saying. I think that we should be specific, and then if a new mechanism comes, we start to debate again. The problem is if we leave this slippery slope, then somebody can put events, right? You remember, we
Well,
have tests that we're using events, and events are unreliable.
yes.
You are not even guaranteed to have an event.
That is at
And
least partially covered by the agreement that this is in a separate package that will be approved by testing leads,
okay, then
right?
it's okay.
Though Patrick is a testing lead, and we will need to
No,
discuss
but
that further.
that's another discussion that
Yeah,
is nice to
I,
have. But
I
that's why I
agree
say
though.
it's
I think
separate.
I didn't necessarily want to write it to preclude the possibility of anything else, but I'm going to be deeply skeptical of. I'm going to need to be convinced for anything that isn't metrics. I think I can't think of one yet. Like you mentioned, events. Events is not a good idea. They're not reliable. They shouldn't be used. I can't. Logs feel similar to me. We don't actually guarantee that they're durable for the duration of the test anyhow, and they can have extremely high cardinality. Like you can have like we have incredibly large log files in some of the CI jobs.
More is the logs is how do you have a constant in a log? A metric is defined. I mean,
Right.
it's 1 or 0, right? But the log, where are you going to match in? Oh, now I mean we changed log messages. You know, it's common in the new contributors to replace
I
a
do
log.
think we should in parallel follow up on that discussion though, because there is something interesting in there about um we don't necessarily have very good log hygiene, and there may be something similar we can do to test this, but I think we should push back against it being the same thing. I don't think it's reasonable to have that as like a default test running everywhere. It's not going to be as portable, and it has other reliability issues. But I don't think it's a bad idea to try to do something somewhere in CI that looks at um, regressions and log spamminess.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. Like if you have a default kind cluster and we run a fairly normal set of end-to-end tests and the log volume doubles overnight, then we probably are doing something we shouldn't. And I do think that's an interesting related angle, but I don't consider it the same as a invariant. We should, if you look at the pull request, the implementation pull request linked from the KEP, then we somewhere in that discussion you can find the log PRN discussion. Here we go. Uh, Here's the logs PR. I just put it in the notes document. And somewhere from that there was also an issue discussing. Here we go. There's a discussion issue for this. Um, there was some discussion about if a metric for that would make sense and where or not it wouldn't be useful. Yeah. So we should follow up on that particular thread, but I think that's the only one that I've seen so far. The other requests that I'm seeing are other metrics. And I think for most SIGs, the check something after everything else, a metric is the appropriate, durable alternative to an event or like a log message or something. And it scales well because we can add more checks with minimal cost because we'll already be fetching all the metrics for any component that's in. Right now, we only fetch API server, but we could fetch additional components, and that should be fine if we need to. Also, well, anyhow, that might be a little too into the weeds. So I encourage everyone to take a look at this. I think this is interesting. We haven't done a KEP in this SIG in a while. Most of the things we do are outside the life cycle. Even this one, we're kind of like aiming to exclude it from the whole alpha, beta, GA, and so on for KEPs. This KEP doesn't really make sense to graduate or something. It's basically we're going to agree to do it, and then we're going to implement it, and then it is implemented, and there is not a there's not like a phased rollout to production because it doesn't run in production. But um the like formal agreement side of it is useful. We've done this in the past for things like winding down Bazel from building Kubernetes, a couple other things like that. We don't use this often enough. I will say it is expensive. Uh, Filling out all the boilerplate takes a lot of time. But I think it was important for this one that we capture an agreement that isn't just from like chatting with Antonio and Patrick in London. And that we have a chance for everyone to provide some feedback on this decision and the approach. Though again, I'm really hoping that we can get this merged soon, because it is the third release of the year. It's going to be short. We're going to have tight timing with KubeCon and everything, and I want to be certain that this isn't introducing problems and that we have to draw back. Because the other thing is, if we have to draw back, sig testing will be fine. Everything we're doing is very long term, trying to keep the CI stable and that sort of thing. But it will have negative impacts for at least a declarative validation KEP. I need to double check. I actually can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but Tim Hawken was involved in in declarative validation and CC'd me on. There was another pull request with a kind of similar API server metric for some other feature. Um, I think it was looking at like repeated error messages from validation. So like if it's like spamming the same error, something like that. And we didn't, there wasn't, I don't think there was a particular rush for that one, but there is already at least one similar use case to follow up on. And I don't, if possible, I don't want to block them longer. We've actually already had at least a full release cycle of discussing this, but not shipping anything. And that feature is the declarative validation feature is progressing. They have started to implement it for more core types, and at some point they want to move forward to beta and GA. And I think one of the API machinery leads considered something along these lines as a bit of a prerequisite to have enough confidence in the feature. So hopefully we can ship no issues. I have tested it many times locally with kind clusters, and it works very well. So I'm not too worried, but there's always the unknown unknowns, and we've already had quite a lot of delay in figuring out a reasonable way to make it work and what sort of restrictions that we might want to put on future related things. Um, Definitely a little bit of a hack using the Sentinel test and separate reporter, but that's kind of par for the course for sig testing. Cool. Well, thanks all. I don't think we had any other topics today.
None that I saw unless it got added last minute, but no, I think that's it.
Since folks came, I'm at least open to hanging around long enough if there's something else you wanted to discuss, or we can probably get like 20 minutes back.
Last call. Any other topics? Sounds good. All right. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks Ben for explaining all of this.
Yeah.
This does look
Anyone
cool.
that kept comments, thanks for coming. Oh wait, there's something in chat. What was that?
Oh,
It's just thanks.
that was the thanks.
Okay. Cool. Thanks all.
Awesome. See ya.